this meeting. And first, I would like to introduce my colleagues on the side of me, both sides. Over here, I have Councilor Michael Green, Councilor Steve Thompson, Councilor Khalid Bey, Councilor Timothy Rudd, and Councilor Joe Driscoll. And I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself.
Chris Ryan, County Legislature, 8th District.
Susan Lerner, Common Cause, New York.
Dustin Zarni on the Douglas County Board of Elections.
All righty, and before I turn this meeting over, first I would like to thank Susan Lerner from Common Cause for coming to offer us her expertise. And I would also like to thank Commissioner Zarni for his persistent pushing and all of you that's here tonight. We are here to discuss redistricting. Redistricting can be done every 10 years after the census. But in the city of Syracuse, we have not done redistricting going on 20 years. And in 20 years, our demographic areas have changed dramatically. Not to mention, the last time they were drawn by electeds. It is my belief that electeds should never draw their own district. So if this legislation moves forward, I will be working to bring on a nonpartisan, independent commission made up of community, business, academia, and others. So this is why we are here tonight. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susan.
Well, thank you so much, President Hunt. I am asking for a volunteer to help hit the page button on the computer. So I'm leaning on a PowerPoint tonight, so you'll bear with me. You're just, when I say next slide, you'll just hit the page down. How's that? Great. All right, so redistricting reform in Syracuse. This is really an exciting topic and an exciting time. Right now, we are in the midst, I think, of a national discussion regarding gerrymandering and how best to draw political district lines so that they fairly represent the voters and give every voter an opportunity to elect the best representative in the legislatures or city councils around the country. There's some important cases on redistricting which are pending in the U.S. Supreme Court, and that's really helped to highlight the importance of this issue. As President Hunt mentioned, it's very unusual that Syracuse did not redraw its lines 10 years ago. Redistricting happens every 10 years after the decennial census to reflect the changes in population that the census tracks. So next slide, please. Right, and hit it again. There we go. All right. After 2008, there's been a wave of local reform for redistricting. Hit it again. Independent redistricting is what people are really talking about. I've talked about the Supreme Court cases that deal with political gerrymandering. Really, the wave of the future is independent redistricting, where legislators and elected officials, as President Hunt said, are not drawing their own political boundary lines, but citizens get together and decide what is a fair map for their particular jurisdiction. Next. And this really was kicked off from the California Proposition 11 in 2007, which is the first one to set up a truly independent redistricting commission joining Arizona. So we had two states in 2007, California and Arizona, that were using independent citizen commissions to draw their district lines. Today we have 14 different jurisdictions, but what's really interesting is 12 of them are in California, and hit it again, and then Austin, Texas. And you will notice all of those locations are west of the Mississippi. We are east of the Mississippi. So if Syracuse were indeed to adopt an independent commission to draw its district lines, it would be the first jurisdiction east of the Mississippi and would be a leader. Right now, the current process, as you may be aware, is set forth in your city charter, and it sets a time frame and a relatively simple procedure for drawing the district lines, but it vests all of the discretion in the hands of the elected officials. And as we know through difficult experience, the elected officials can elect not to change anything, as was the case 10 years ago. Next slide, please. So the current process requires redistricting if after the census a district has less than 15% or less of the city's population, or 25% or more of the city's population. That's a pretty broad arrangement, and it gives you a lot of stretch, which is how I think you ended up without a redistricting 10 years ago. The district shall have no less than 17% of the city's population, nor more than 23%. And the council is exclusively in charge. Redistricting done by ordinance, and the mayor has no vote of approval or disapproval, and the public isn't really part of the process, except to the extent that they talk to their common council members. So the consequences of the current process are somewhat unfortunate. The maps do not reflect current communities of interest. They're 20 years out of date, and it's difficult to effectively represent constituents when the maps are so out of line with the actual demographic patterns in the city. So for instance, what we see in Council District 1, there's been an influx of new Americans, and that results in a serious overpopulation of that council district. And the changes that have taken place naturally in CD4 are not reflected in the district map, because there you've got a district where the increasing popularity of living downtown, something which wasn't really happening 20 years ago, has had an impact on the population, and the maps that are drawn should reflect that. So why adopt a local commission? Hit it again. You want to depoliticize redistricting. Now, you may hear a lot, oh, it's inherently political. To some degree, yes, but that doesn't mean that it has to be unfair, right? So you want to depoliticize in the sense that you want to have a fair set of standards, and to have the public feel that the map accurately reflects who the people of Syracuse are, how they live, where they gather. And a local commission increases public engagement and transparency. Just by the nature of being a citizen commission, it increases the interest which other citizens have in this process. It improves community representation. And it improves minority representation because everybody has a stake. So, for instance, where you have a independent committee, like in Anaheim, you've added 2 minority districts. In Chula Vista, California, you've ended up adding 2 minority districts. And same thing in San Diego, where you've seen an uptick in minority districts and districts which reflect a very vibrant LGBTQ community in San Diego. Let's go on. And Merced, which is in the very heartland of the California Central Valley, added 1 minority district, and there it's very likely to be a Latino district. So at bottom, the real impact is that it improves the public's faith in their government and their trust in government, because they feel it's a more accurate representation and reflection of who the community is. So Austin, we believe at Common Cause, is a really excellent case study and model for what you may want to do here in Syracuse. It was the first city to really go for a independent commission, and it's been very successful. It was adopted by the voters in 2012, and it was an initiative placed on the ballot by the citizens of Austin, who formed a group called Austinites for Geographic Representation. The amendment required single-member districts, and it authorized the commission to do a complete redistricting in 2013. The results are striking. Over 500 Austinites applied to be on the commission. Over 550 people submitted testimony, along with countless maps which the citizens themselves drew to provide and support their testimony at crowded public hearings. 78 candidates ran for office in 10 newly created districts, and there were dozens of candidate forums in which many of the candidates participated throughout the city rather. And unlike the situation with the previous exclusively at-large council, the candidates obviously had to be dispersed throughout the city. With the at-large system that was replaced, all of the council members ended up being residents of only 2 of the new districts. Very imbalanced representation. 2014 voter turnout, which was the first election with the new districts, was higher than it had been in the previous city elections. And that was the fact, even though Texas had a new law which required a photo ID at the polls, which displaced turnout in other places. And then in 2018, the new city council was more ethnically and racially diverse, and the council has really been able to draw on its geographic legitimacy in taking action. Next slide, please. And as you can see from the quotes that we have here, the council members and the candidates who ran are uniformly positive in terms of the impact of the independent redistricting. There was so much interest among people whom I've met who have said, I never really followed city elections before, but this is really such an exciting time. Now I feel like I have a stronger voice. Is the comment from one of the candidates who ran in a city district race. Next slide, please. And the participation by the public in the process was really, really inspiring. There was a tremendous amount of engagement and a serious group of citizens who took the process very, very seriously, and who attended and really worked hard to balance the interests. And that really is a part of the key to this, is having the right people who serve on the commission, having a selection process which allows you to have citizens who reflect the diversity of your city, who are drawing the maps, and who engage the public in a really interesting and important process of talking about how do we live and work in Syracuse? Where are the important locations in our city? Where are people gathering? Where do they live? And how do we reflect that politically in a way that's fair? So Austin now has a generally fair map for the city council districts, very well-regarded process, and I believe that it forms a good model for what you may want to do here in Syracuse. So how should you go about this? There are a lot of different ways. First, obviously, you're going to need to change your charter. So the charter amendment, which is starting to be discussed, I think, is obviously the important first step. And there are a couple of different ways that you can do that. One way is certainly the way that I believe is being discussed, which is really rather than trying to outline every single detail of the process of appointing and running the commission, is to give the Common Council the flexibility through its normal process to write an ordinance that would set up the independent commission. So that would then, following the charter amendment, lead you to legislation, which would actually set up the commission, would give you an opportunity for a robust legislative process, hearings, input from the public, and really craft a process and a commission structure that works for Syracuse. Following that, obviously, is the implementation of the plan, crafting the policies and procedures to implement the Independent Citizens Reform Commission, really fleshing out the basic structure that your ordinance would set up. And you follow that up with partnering with community and advocacy groups to educate the public about the process and encourage diverse applicants to apply to be on the commission. And my prediction is, just like in Austin, in the state of California, and so many places that have independent redistricting, you are going to see an outpouring of citizens who, when they have an opportunity to be on the commission, are going to apply. And that is actually one of the exciting things about this process, is how engaged people become. Next slide, please. So here are some of the things that we believe that you should be thinking about when you are looking at your charter revision provision. You want an independent authority that actually has authorization, not just an advisory commission. You want fairness. You need to be sure that the commissioners are independent and impartial. So getting the selection method right is correct, and being sure that you have the right qualifications. And again, there are models in the cities that have done this, that run from Merced, California, through San Diego to Austin, that can help guide your discussions and give you some ideas of the kind of things that you would want to put in. And you want to be sure that in your selection process, you have built in a requirement for accurate representation of the people who actually live here, that you have commission diversity based on who are the people living in Syracuse, not some abstract, but what your demographics actually are, and that you want to have neighborhood and community-centric redistricting criteria in the ordinance that you finally adopt. Next slide, please. So when you're thinking about the charter language, there are some specific suggestions which we have, and we have been in touch with folks about the specific language, and really compliment the staff and your council for the diligence and the creativity of this approach. We really suggest that rather than having a statement like 6 months after the census data comes down, or using some other signpost, that you have a very specific date by which you plan to impanel the commission. It just is easier in our experience if you're working with a calendar rather than with a date which could shift. We have a general idea of more or less when the census data is likely to come down. And if you've kicked off the process a little bit early, well, you're just that much more prepared and not worrying about a shortened time period if the census data comes down a little later than anticipated. You want to be sure that you've got clear criteria for independence in the charter revision. So we recommend bar conflicts of interest that would prevent commissioners from being fair and impartial. And again, there are various ways to do that, and I think that the Corporation Council has some good ideas. Of course, because you are going to be relying on an ordinance, you want to have the ability to amend the ordinance, but we would suggest that you don't want language in there that would encourage frequent revisions of the ordinance and the process. Because once you've developed a good process, you don't want to come back over and over again and pick it apart and reshuffle it. You really want to have some continuity. And when you're thinking about the criteria for maps, you do definitely want to have districts which are more or less equal in size, but because you're dealing with districts which are much smaller in size than the congressional districts, where the requirement is that they have to be absolutely equal in size, plus or minus no more than one voter, what we find is that in smaller districts, like city council districts, you need to have some flexibility. If you're really going to reflect the communities of interest and the patterns by which people live, work, and gather, then you need to have more flexibility than absolute equality. Yes, they have to be equal, but you need a reasonable variability, and the case law can be helpful in that regard. So once you are beyond the basic facts of the charter revision, when you're really thinking about the commission, we think that you need to be thinking about 5 questions. Who is drawing the maps, and how are they being selected? And often this ends up being, in some ways, the most interesting and sometimes the most complicated discussion, because so much rests on who is drawing the maps and how they're selected. Who's going to be in the commission? How are you going to decide that? And so much follows once you've got the commission properly set up and they are independent, then everything flows more easily from that. What powers does the commission have? There are some commissions which actually draw the maps but then recommend them to the council. We recommend a truly independent commission. They draw the maps and then the maps are go into effect. What criteria should be applied in drawing the districts? At Common Cause, in the last redistricting cycle, we actually drew reform maps. We got very familiar with the process and how you apply the criteria. And one of the things that we learned very quickly was it's not only the criteria themselves, but the order in which you apply them. So, because nothing can happen simultaneously, you basically run through a list of criteria and try and fix the map one by one by one. And which criteria you have that has precedence radically changes the map. So it's the criteria and the ordering of the criteria. And then what can you do? How do you determine how transparent and what public input will be provided in the process? Do you want to have very general language, or do you want to have some basic requirements, a floor of number of hearings, of locations of hearings? These are things that you want to be thinking about. And then, how should the final map be chosen? Some commissions decide that you need a supermajority. Some commissions require specific voting rules as to how to ensure that the map will be fair and equitable. And these are the things that you'll be dealing with. And that, again, there are excellent models, and my organization and others who are prepared to help and to provide suggestions and help you through the process. What values? Because what we're really talking about, after all, when we're talking about redistricting, is what are the political values that Syracuse wants to hold up and to be sure are followed in this process of setting political boundary lines. Fairness, equal representation, transparency, racial equity, diversity are many of the values which are mentioned when we deal with independent redistricting commissions that are citizen-run. But are there other aspects that here in Syracuse you want to be cognizant of? And that's part of the discussion which I hope you'll be having over the next several months as you work out and pass a charter revision commission and then a citywide discussion in terms of the values when you're actually putting together the ordinance and figuring out how your commission is going to run. So thank you for the opportunity to present to you and to share our experience, and we look forward to working with you if indeed, as I hope it does, this process goes forward.
Thank you, Susan. And before I move on, because I just want to say this, okay?